Thank you, Teresa and Maria, for organizing this wonderful workshop and for having me here. Today, I'm going to talk about a work in progress, idealizing the history of science for philosophical purposes, which is a work in the methodology of integrated history and philosophy of science. This is actually really work in progress. It's quite explorative and programmatic, so critical questions and feedback from you all are especially welcome. So let's start. Today, I want to defend or motivate a controversial thesis that practitioners of integrated history and philosophy of science, HPS, are justified in idealizing the history of science for philosophical purposes. And my methodological strategy as an epistemology, engaging constructive criticism, I theorize about the epistemic properties and norms of HPS as an epistemic practice by taking very seriously the skeptical objections against the viability of integrated history and philosophy of science. But also I rely upon case studies because I think that this epistemological theorizing studies HPS in the making as well. And finally, I am methodological pluralist, and what I want to do today is to bring together the literature or the work on the philosophy of scientific modeling and the self-reflective work on the methodology of integrated HPS in order to think about the nature and the role of idealization in HPS. And in doing so, I want to critically examine commonsensical assumption, according to which scientific practice and the practice of HPS are asymmetrical in epistemic terms. There is an epistemic asymmetry as to the role of idealization in these two epistemic practices. Philosophers working on scientific modeling has argued that idealization in science is epistemically valuable, but many colleagues in history and philosophy of science considers that idealization of path science is not epistemically valuable, it's epistemically objectionable. And I want to discuss this commonsensical assumption. And my strategy is to dismantle the prima facie compelling reasons for defending these presuppositions. And one good reason is one that poses a serious methodological challenge for the integration of history and philosophy. And the argument can be put as follows. The premise one says that integrated HPS involves no distinct methodology in the sense that it is not over and above the standards of good philosophy on the one hand and the standards of good historiography on the other hand. Second premise states that idealization of past science is epistemically essential and pervasive in the historical philosophy of science as a subfield of integrated HPS. Premise 3 says that idealization of science violates standards of good historiography. And as a conclusion, we have that idealization of past science precludes historical philosophy of science as a subfield of integrated HPS. Let's turn to flesh out each premise. First one, no distinct methodology for integrated HPS. According to the HPS manifesto, there is no distinct methodology that is HPS. Doing HPS does not confer free pass to suspend the standards of one field to advance the other. It must be good history of science and philosophy, in that these claims are based on a solid grounding in appropriate sources and are located in the relevant context. And the following Arabatsis too, we have two ways of doing integrated HPS. On the one hand, we have HPS as philosophical history of science, which is historical work drawing upon philosophical frameworks to address historiographical issues. And on the other hand, we have HPS as historical philosophy of science, which is philosophical work relying upon historical studies to address philosophical concerns. And in particular, historical philosophy of science uses or employs historical case studies to make philosophical points. Today, I want to focus in historical philosophy of science as a subfield of integrated HPS. Because premise 2 says that idealization of past science in historical philosophy of science is essential and pervasive. Some clarificatory information first. We have that historical case studies can be used in different ways. We can use a case study to illustrate or make a vivid sense of philosophical concepts and claims, as heuristics to articulate philosophical concepts and claims in an hermeneutical fashion, and as evidence to support or to justify philosophical conclusions about science. And these uses are obviously non-exhaustive ways of making philosophical points, and they are not mutually exclusive. One same case study can serve more than one of these uses. Now, regarding idealization in scientific practice, we have that the practice of idealization consists of the intentional introduction of distortion into scientific theories or models, and we don't have yet any exact or precise definition of what distortion means, but we can understand distortion as misrepresentation of the target system, because distort is to introduce false assumptions that represent things as having features they clearly don't have, right? So we will work on this characterization, operational characterization. And a prominent strategy of idealization as distortion in scientific practice is what Winsberg calls minimalist idealization, which consists in constructing models that include only the core causal factors which give rise to the phenomenon. And minimalist idealization seeks to adequately represent explanatory relevant factors. It always distorts explanatory irrelevant factors, and in some cases, it distorts at least some even explanatory relevant factors. So the function of minimalist idealization is to provide explanation. And in order to provide explanation, we isolate the core causal factor that explain the phenomenon, and in doing so, we are distorting the irrelevant factors. So to see the link between idealization in scientific practice and idealization in historical philosophy of science, I will draw upon a case study in historical philosophy of science. This is the prominent work of Kyle Stanford, in which he provides a historical challenge to scientific realism. I suppose that philosophers are well familiar with Stanford's work and argument. And Stanford's work counts as historical philosophy of science for the following reason. First of all, the space problem, following Alan Slove's here, is philosophical, is of philosophy, because Stanford tries to address a philosophical issue in the context of the scientific realism debate in the philosophy of science. His position, his contribution is the thesis of the problem of unconceived alternatives as a serious historical challenge, one of underdetermination to explanation of scientific realism in the context of this debate. And to establish this philosophical point, Stanford draws upon a historical case study of the 19th century biological, mechanical, and materialist theories of generation and inheritance. And he considers specifically the work of three historical actors: Darwin's theory of pangenesis, Galston's stirp theory, and Weizmann's germ plants theory. And basically, what the Stanford does is to employ the historical case study of biological theorizing to establish the problem of unconceived alternatives in order to pose a serious challenge to scientific realism in the context of this philosophical debate. So this is history of science used for philosophical purposes. And this use of history for philosophical purpose in the case of Stanford is TOEFL. Stanford first used some brief examples to illustrate the significance of the problem of concept alternatives in the early history of modern theorizing about problems of generation and inheritance. But we also have that the most prominent or most important use here is the evidential one. According to Stanford, the evidence we have seen from 19th century theories of inheritance strongly suggests that the problem of unconceived alternatives represents a serious prima facie challenge to scientific realism. No, I want to suggest that we can characterize Stanford historical case study as a minimalist idealization in Winsberg's sense, because the problem of unconceived alternatives describes, but first and foremost explains a historical pattern as involving a twofold core explanatory factor. On the one hand, we have that the problem of unconceived alternatives explains actors' theories acceptance via eliminative inference. The problem of conceived alternatives explains the specific type of the type of scientific reasoning involved in theory acceptance during this historical episode, and also the problem of conceived alternatives clearly gives an account on actors' repeated failures to conceive of successors, serious candidates or alternatives. Focusing on a hard case from biological science, Stanford characterizes the theoretical account each historical actors developed and defended to explain inheritance phenomena, offering a narrative that describes a process of successive replacement of one explanation by the other. In doing so, Stanford reconstructs the process of this theorizing by focusing on three actors' seminal work. Without hindsight, Stanford goes on to establish a historical thesis concerning eliminative inference, which is one. As historical actors' pronouncements themselves suggest, each actor took his own hypothesis as providing the only conceivable explanation of phenomena given the evidence available at the time. And with hindsight, Stanford finally establishes a historical thesis, which is two, concerning the problem of conceived alternatives, according to which historical actors were facing the epistemic predicament simply because they were unable to consider successor alternative theoretical explanation of the same phenomena, which would have been perfectly conceivable and acceptable as a serious candidate in light of the available evidence at the time. So we find pronouncements of this time. For instance, that Darwin himself conceived of the supposed pangenesis as eliminative in character, and that Darwin simply failed to conceive of or to consider the entire class of theoretical alternatives to pangenesis. And Stanford's case study is minimalist because it focused exclusively on establishing one and two as epistemic factors while excluding several other elements of a complex historical situation. Stanford disregards the role of practices and material culture relating to the experiments he considers in some detail, for instance, Galston's and Dry's experiments, and more ones. He also dismisses the cultural context in the production, evaluation, and transmission of the theoretical alternatives about the fundamental mechanism of inheritance he addressed, and Stanford accounts for the epistemic connections of actor scientific beliefs regardless of the social organization, values, and interests of scientific communities in theorizing on inheritance. In this way, Stanford does not include actors' pronouncements about metaphysical, religious, and political commitments, such as Galton's commitment to eugenics, and established no explanatory connection between these pronouncements, the epistemic pronouncements about eliminative inference and so on, and establishes and the rich cultural and political context of England and Germany in the 19th century. So Stanford isolates the core epistemic factor that explain theories acceptance and the problem of conceived alternatives and isolates all these contextual and actual elements of the episode. So let's turn to consider why this way of doing philosophy of science based upon history is epistemically objectionable. According to mainstream historiography of science, the purpose of historical analysis is to understand scientific past, and we understand scientific past by means of historical contextualization. By elucidating the historical context, we can give an account of the scientific episode in question. And this historical contextualization pursues what I call the completeness ideal for historical representation. In this analysis, a historical context is a set of factors that provide an explanatory framework for scientific episodes, and completeness involves several criteria. First of all, we have inclusion, which tells us to include as many factors of the episode as possible. Second, fidelity, represent every included factor as accurately as possible. And coherence, articulate all factors in a consistent narrative that maintains the historical integrity of the episode. For instance, the historian Shaping says that we are historians, as what we do when we do history is to try to tell it as it really was in the past. As historians of science, we're committed to telling rich, detailed, and we hope accurate stories about science. The historian Butterfield says that if we need further elucidation of a scientific episode, all that we can do is to take us into greater detail and make us see in a still more definite concreteness what really did take place. The historian Krasnow argues that completeness allows historians to avoid the first horn of Pitt's dilemma of case studies, because cherry picking can be addressed by requiring that all the relevant details of the case be considered and not just those that are relevant to the favorite hypothesis. And the historian of science, John Henry, says that completeness expresses the professional commitment of historians of science, because a striving for an even richer contextualization can be seen as the driving force in current historiography of science, and it has been the main ambition of the majority of his practitioners for a number of decades. The result is a subdiscipline of history which is flourishing in its own terms. So for history of science, God is in the details. Now, if we apply completeness in order to evaluate the quality of Stanford's minimalist case study, the verdict would be negative. We would say that Stanford's minimalist case study is not a good historical reconstruction. First of all, his idealization strategy in minimalist terms involves three subtypes of objectionable idealization or objectionable distortion. The first of all is distortion of emphasis, which exaggerates the explanatory role of philosophical points. For instance, the historian John Brooke says that when the circumstances and the problems were so complex, the isolation of a single philosophical or methodological point as the key to an adequate explanation must lead to a distortion of emphasis. And Stanford seems to overemphasize the explanatory role of the problem of unconceived alternatives. He distorts historical facts as he exaggerates the explanatory role of this problem, because his historical narrative retrospectively compares theories of inheritance from Darwin through Galton, through Weismann, to show that actors face this epistemic predicament. He therefore poses this problem as explaining why actors accepted each theory as the lone contender to explain the phenomena of inheritance. This emphasis on the philosophical point leads Stanford to exclude the occurrence of further factors that could also explain the epistemic status Darwin, Galton, and Weismann attributed to their theories, factors which could have shaped their Trajan acceptance and inconceivability. But Stanford is also facing a distortion of differentiation, because it imposes a monolithic rational structure on a complex historical situation that leaves differences out. Brooke says the richness of scientific enterprises also get lost when the dead hand of reconstruction fails to discriminate. And Stanford seems to uniformize the actual diversity of more specific factors in the historical pattern described by the problem of conceived alternatives. Even if textual evidence plausibly suggests that actors have conceived of the theoretical alternatives despite the fact that they don't so, and even if the benefits of hindsight shows that they failed to conceive of these alternatives, Stanford appears to be reducing the reason for the acceptance and replacement of theories to the problem of conceived alternatives. And finally, a distortion as a dichotomy is involved here. And this problem, the problem here is that it draws an alternative divide between internal and external factors. According to Brooke, to suppose that only dissentas are affected by externalisms or constraints is arbitrary and creates an impoverishment of historical understanding. According to the critics of the so-called internal history, philosophical case studies distinguish between internal and external rational factors upon the philosophical point, right? So internal history explains the rationality of science and external history explains the deviations from rationality. The problem here is that it is quite artificial to think that internal and external explanations are mutually exclusive rather than complementary. John Henry thinks that historians' attitude in contemporary history of science is eclecticism, is not drawing artificial divides between what is internal as rational and what is external as irrational, in light of the philosophical point at hand. Okay, from this evaluation of Stanford's minimalist case study on the basis of the ideal of completeness, we says that idealization of path science is epistemically objectionable. Brooke says again, Yuan's ultimate goal is an understanding of what actually happened. There must surely be a limit beyond which the degree of caricature becomes unacceptable. So unsurprisingly, many people aligns with this perspective. Bichedo says that case studies methodology doesn't take history seriously, and Pitt says that this approach is doing bad history. Bernard Cohen says that the philosophical use of history produces false or imagined history, and Brooke again says that philosophical case studies are a precarious enterprise. But the problem, as a consequence of this objectional character of idealization of path science, is that this idealization precludes the integration of history and philosophy as historical philosophy. Shikore says, concerns about the historical adequacy of philosophically significant case studies arise. If the analysis adheres too closely to the historical record, the stories thus produced are unlikely to be of interest to the analyst who is interested in making the philosophical point as clear as possible. In turn, case studies designed to serve philosophical ends would be at best uninteresting, at worst unacceptable to the historian. And many people share this pessimistic verdict. No, what I want to do, yes?
You have 5 more minutes.
Okay, thank you. And what I want to do is to block this methodological challenge by critically examining the premise 2 and 3 in order to block the inference of the conclusion from the premises. I propose to block the premise 2 by adopting a general strategy which proposes several epistemological commitments, so to speak. First of all, I suggest that we must reject epistemological chauvinism about completeness, because not every historical representation must be as complete as possible in order to be good. Second, we adopt the adequacy for purpose view, Wendy Parker, And the idea here is that the quality of historical representations depends upon their inadequacy for specific purposes. I suggest that adequacy for purposes doesn't replace completeness, but subsume it. So, if we subsume completeness under adequacy for purposes, we have that completeness must still apply to the set of historical representations that serve the purposes of historiography of science. So this is a useful criteria in the context of historiography of science for pursuing historiographical purposes, but completeness doesn't need to apply to the set of historical representations that serve the purpose of historical philosophy of science. And finally, we adopt a subsume in this way by not forgetting to get our historical facts straight. So I suggest that idealized historical representations are required to prima facie satisfy a minimal yet sufficient dose of historical adequacy. And this is quite compatible with the nature of minimalist idealization. Let me explain. On the basis of these epistemological commitments, I want to propose a definition of optimal idealization of history, according to which distortion of past science is optimal for a given philosophical purpose and prima facie satisfies a minimal yet sufficient dose of historical adequacy if and only if our minimal case study satisfies the following conditions. First of all, is conducive to the philosophical purpose, retains historical process and context, contains no tension between explanatory factors, adequately represents the central factors of the episode, potentially specifies all the relevant actual factors of the episode, and creates no artificial internal versus external divide. And notice that the condition 4 corresponds to distortion of emphasis, condition 5 corresponds to distortions of differentiation, and condition 6 corresponds to distortion of the dichotomy, or in terms of dichotomy. So in light of this proposal, let's consider what happened when we evaluate Stanford's minimalist historical case study in light of my new epistemology. First of all, Stanford minimalist case study seems well suited for its philosophical purpose. Stanford aims to draw philosophical lessons from historical information. He's interested in telling something relevant about philosophical issues based upon what we know about history. For this philosophical purpose, he doesn't need to produce a rich, detailed, and concrete representation of historical events. Rather, he focuses on those aspects of the historical episode that are salient and relevant to the philosophical point he wants to make. But besides purpose fitness, Stanford's case study also seems to meet the other conditions for optimal idealization. Stanford case study is not leaving the historical context out. The problem of a concept alternatives refers to a robust historical pattern of theoretical succession in which scientists were devising explanations of biological inheritance for almost a century. Also, Stanford does pay attention to the temporal process. The problem of unconceived alternatives can justifiably be seen as a claim about scientific change that explain the process of theoretical change and acceptance in a particular domain of biological inquiry. Furthermore, Stanford prevents the problem of internal history from arising. Contrary to rational reconstructions, Stanford explains the error or failure of actors in exhausting the space of alternatives by appealing to epistemic reasons. Given his own intellectualist approach to history, Stanford indicates that such a failure stems from a conceptual obstacle. The priority of internal history boils down to explaining failure in terms of external factors, but Stanford nonetheless explains errors by appealing to actors' epistemic reasons that are quite internal elements. So he is not drawing an artificial or arbitrary divide between the internal and the external. And finally, notice that if the problem of unconceived alternatives were capturing a real historical pattern, then this would be enough explanation for philosophical purposes without curtailing the account's historical adequacy, the minimal dose of historical adequacy. Furthermore, Stanford opens the door for other explanatory factors to enrich the historical understanding of the episode in terms of the problem of unconceived alternatives. Stanford notes that in constructing his case study, he avoided any exploration of the reality and consequences of our repeated failures to conceive of the full range of well-confirmed theoretical alternatives to any particular account of the presumably heterogeneous and untidy sources of those failures. Such an account we would be provided by social, cultural history of science amounts to an empirical exploration of the various dynamical processes that help explain how and why unconceived alternatives remain unconceived by particular human scientists and scientific communities. So on this perspective, Stanford naturally claims that this complementary study would serve his aims in exceeding our graphs rather than compete with his proposal. And finally, until stronger defeating reasons, Stanford's case study holds a minimal yet sufficient dose of historical adequacy, and he explicitly says that if more recent developments in the historical scholarship concerning this period undermined either my reading of the primary sources of the use I have made of them in trying to establish the general significance of the problem of unconceived alternatives itself, I trust that my colleagues in the history of science will set me straight. So the epistemic value of minimalist idealization in the philosophical history of science is prima facie positive until we have stronger reasons to call into question the minimal dose of historical adequacy that the historical reconstruction we are evaluating would have. Okay, and if my strategy to block in the second premise work, then I propose to block the first premise too, in the way of disambiguating what Arabatsis means by distinct and suspend standards in the HPS manifesto. And if we understand this distinct and suspend as rejecting, as giving up the standards of good history of science, then I disagree. Sorry, I agree with Arabatsis. But if you understand distinct and suspend as weighing differently standards and applying in a different way, then I disagree with Arabatsis. And my suggestion is that standards for evaluating historical case studies in the historical philosophy are differently weighted in relation to the purpose of interest. That is to say that requiring different doses of stuff. And I think that there is a crucial point because HPS is an interdisciplinary enterprise. An interdisciplinary research consists of integrating approaches in order to tackle complex problems that cannot be plausibly solved by the tools of the disciplines as taken separately. And if difficult interdisciplinary work demands this sort of principal flexibility with the standards in order to tackle these difficult problems at the intersection of the disciplines being integrated, why we are excluding history and philosophy of science from such epistemic flexibility. So my conclusion is that if my foregoing constructive criticism works, then it not seems less obvious that idealization of path science is not epistemically valuable in history and philosophy of science, and it's not obvious either that idealization of path science precludes integrated HPS itself. And thanks for listening.
Thank you, Dubian.
Everybody, please clap for Dubian in the reactions. Now let's move to the Q&A. We only have 14 minutes. Let's be efficient. I'm going to have Atocha first and then Kirsten. Atocha, please.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great.
Yes.
Dubian, yeah, thanks for, being so compact in presenting your research. And also, please allow me, Maria, to greet him for his prize by the International Union of History and Philosophy of Science and Technology. For those people who don't know it, he won the essay prize. Anyway, but my question is, perhaps a clarification question about your notion of idealization. You make the distinction between idealization and empirical adequacy. And my question here is, to what extent, if at all, this is connected to Leszek Nowak proposal of actually a methodology for idealization and concretization in models? Meaning that, well, building a model is a way of idealizing, of making an abstraction of reality, and concretization is to go back. So I was wondering about that. Could you tell us something?
Yeah, thank you for your question, Atocha, and good to see you. My answer is the following. I am working with a distinction between idealization as distortion and historical adequacy as a quality that allows us to evaluate how good is a historical case study or a historical representation more generally. We have a historical representation, and then we can use the completeness ideal, which tells us that the best historical representation is the most complete, the most rich, the most detailed, and the most historically adequate. But idealized historical representations doesn't satisfy this desideratum. So it creates a tension between idealization and historical adequacy. Now, there are proposals in the literature on scientific models according to which you can idealize the idealized account, right? This is called Galilean idealization. What I am saying is that insofar as we evaluate philosophical case studies on the basis of adequacy for purposes rather than completeness, then we don't need to idealize the minimalist case study.
Clear
because
now.
Because the minimal representation is well suited for the philosophical purpose.
Okay.
But in order for this minimal idealization not to be arbitrary, we need to introduce minimal doses of historical adequacy. Because otherwise, because we need to ground philosophical theorizing on history, on factual knowledge about science. Otherwise, we can use science fiction or appealing to our intuitions or appealing to other kinds of grounds. So we need a minimal dose of historical adequacy in order to have a minimalist model that, insofar as it is well suited for the philosophical purpose of interest, then is a good historical reconstruction.
I see. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Kirsten, please.
Hi, thanks for your talk. That was really, really interesting. I really liked your use of Kyle Stanford's work as a kind of is a really interesting example of this kind of historical disagreement. I I've heard Stanford talk about his work before, but I haven't looked at the literature where people are pointing out that maybe his historical work isn't very good. But so that was really helpful for me to see what's going on there. Just to quickly weigh in on the previous question, because I was kind of confused about your use of the term idealization too. So the last time I looked at this literature, the key distinction was between people were working with a distinction between idealizations and abstractions. And idealization is a distortion, whereas an abstraction is taking things away from the theory or the account. And it seemed like you were running those two things together sometimes. And it might be useful to separate them out, I'm not sure. And I think that brings me to the question I had, which was, I think it's going to be a kind of really completeness. I don't know, so it strikes me that if you asked a historian like what they're trying to do, I don't think they would ever tell you that they're trying to tell you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. I don't think I think, completeness, if you're trying to do completeness as a historian, you're basically trying to deliver a chronology or something where you're trying to include every single event that occurred. But not even historians are trying to do that. They're trying to generate some sort of historical narrative, like a narrative explanation or something. And that inevitably involves foregrounding some things, backgrounding other things. You have to decide what it is you're going to leave out as much as you're leaving in. And so, I guess I'm kind of curious, is completeness kind of your gloss on what they're trying to do? Is that your term, or is that something that people in the field are saying?
Yeah, thank you, Kirsten. Okay, two questions. Regarding the format about the distinction between abstraction and idealization, in my overall project, not in what I have presented today, I am also considering different strategies of idealization, but today I only focus on minimalist because it fits Stanford's. But I am also considering abstraction as a type of idealization. And the difference between abstraction and idealization as distortion and as minimalist relies at least on two aspects. We have good reasons for thinking that abstraction is a form of idealization because when you are leaving things out, you are distorting other things. So you cannot simply abstract without distorting. This is Rice's point, for instance, or Potonic's point. If abstraction invariably distort, then abstraction is Galilean idealization. You idealize in the context of mathematical and experimental sciences in order to make the model more easily computable. But once you satisfy your pragmatic ends, you de-idealize and have a more concrete or more complete model of the target. So abstraction can be Galilean because we can introduce the elements you have abstracted from in the first place. But a further aspect of abstraction is that these kind of models are not causally informative. They are not providing causal information, and therefore they are not explanatory. Minimalist idealization is primarily explanatory. My case study to illustrate, to articulate, and to support idealization as abstraction is Nancy Cartwright's Tangle of Science and his use of Ha-Seok Chang's study on the invention of the thermometric techniques, right? I think that it covers your first question about the difference. Okay. And regarding the completeness ideal, no, this is not my position. This is what mainstream professional historiography of science thinks. So I quote a lot of a lot of historians saying that. But I don't think that there is a naive position. I mean, completeness is an ideal. No absolutely complete representation is possible. But in order to get factual knowledge about the historical context, on the basis of which you illuminate the historical episode in question, historian says, add more and more detail, because it allows us to avoid cherry picking, because it provides more information, because it provides triangulation and many other ways of making your representation more objective, so to speak. Yeah, and I think that there is one of the reasons professional historians argue for rejecting our invitation as SPS practitioners to bring together history and philosophy, among many other objections. Thank you for your questions.